I was standing there in my cap and gown, diploma in hand, when my phone buzzed with a text that would change everything. The message was from my mother. "Don't bother coming to the family dinner. You're no longer our daughter. Figure out your own life from now on." No congratulations, no pride, just complete rejection on what should have been the happiest day of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The graduation ceremony had just ended at State University. Around me, families were hugging, taking photos, celebrating their children's achievements. I watched as my roommate Jessica ran into her parents' arms as they showered her with flowers and tears of joy. Meanwhile, I stood alone on the campus lawn, staring at that cold text message, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't entirely unexpected, but the timing was brutal. This was supposed to be my moment. 4 years of engineering school, graduating summa cum laude, landing a prestigious job offer at a tech company in Seattle. I had done everything right, exceeded every expectation, and yet here I was, officially cut off from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The worst part wasn't even the rejection itself. It was that I could see them across the courtyard, my parents Michael and Linda, along with my younger brother Tyler. They were there, at my graduation, but not for me. They had come to watch Tyler receive some minor academic award for his sophomore year. They couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge that their daughter was graduating with highest honors from one of the most competitive programs in the state. I watched from a distance as they posed for photos with Tyler, their faces beaming with pride. The same pride they had never shown me, not once in 22 years. My mother was wearing the blue dress I had bought her for Mother's Day, the one she said was too expensive but secretly loved. My father had his arm around Tyler's shoulder, that protective gesture I had always yearned for but never received. The text message was the final blow, but it was also strangely liberating. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to smile and accept their indifference. I didn't have to make excuses for why they treated me like I was invisible while treating Tyler like he was made of gold. I turned away from them and walked toward the parking lot. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Tyler. "Mom and Dad are pretty upset. Maybe you should apologize." Apologize? For what? For existing? For succeeding? For daring to expect basic human decency from my own family? I got into my car, a modest Honda Civic that I had bought with money from my part-time job at the campus bookstore. As I drove away from the university, away from what should have been a celebration, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not anger, but a strange sense of clarity. They thought they were punishing me by disowning me. They had no idea they were actually setting me free. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. I had already accepted the job in Seattle and planned to move there in a few weeks. My lease was ending, my belongings were mostly packed, and now, I had no family obligations holding me back. I could start fresh, build the life I wanted without constantly seeking approval from people who would never give it. But as I sat in my empty apartment that night, surrounded by boxes and the silence of isolation, I realized something important. This wasn't the end of my story. This was just the beginning. And while my parents thought they had control over me, they were about to learn that the quiet, overlooked daughter they had just discarded was not the helpless girl they believed her to be. My phone stayed silent for the rest of the evening. No calls from relatives who had witnessed the family drama at graduation. No messages from family friends asking what had happened. Just the peaceful quiet of a life that was finally, truly, my own. I opened my laptop and began researching real estate markets in Seattle, property management companies, and mortgage lending practices. If I was going to build a new life, I was going to do it right. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't just going to survive without them. I was going to thrive. And someday, when they realized what they had lost, it would be too late to take it back. I had no idea that in just 3 years, I would hold the power to make or break their financial future. But that revelation was still to come. The next morning, I woke up to missed calls from my Aunt Sarah, my mother's sister. She had been at the graduation and witnessed the whole thing. Her voicemail was gentle but firm. "Emma, honey, what happened yesterday was wrong. I want you to know that not everyone in this family feels the way your parents do. You're an amazing young woman, and I'm proud of you. Call me when you're ready." It was the first kind words I had heard from anyone in my family in months. But even Aunt Sarah's support couldn't erase the years of systematic neglect and favoritism that had led to this moment. This wasn't just about one bad day or one cruel text message. This was the culmination of a lifetime of being treated as secondary, as less important, as expendable. I thought back to my childhood, to all the moments that had built up to this. The birthday parties where Tyler got elaborate celebrations while I got a simple cake and a few presents. The school events where they rushed to Tyler's games but missed my academic competitions. The Christmas mornings where Tyler's pile of gifts towered over mine, and when I asked why, my mother would sigh and say, "We can't afford to spoil both of you." But it wasn't really about money. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was about priorities. Tyler was their priority. I was their afterthought. And now, on the most important day of my academic career, they had made it crystal clear that nothing had changed. I was still the expendable one, the one who could be discarded without consequence. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for longer than they could imagine. Not consciously, perhaps, but every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked had made me more self-reliant, more determined, more focused on building a future that didn't depend on their approval or support. As I packed the last of my belongings and prepared for my move to Seattle, I felt a strange sense of gratitude. They had tried to break me, but instead they had forged me into something stronger. They had tried to make me dependent on their love, but instead they had taught me to find strength in myself. And now, as I stepped into my new life, I was equipped with something they would never have: the knowledge that I could succeed entirely on my own terms. The job in Seattle was with an innovative tech startup that specialized in financial technology. I would be working on algorithms that helped banks and mortgage companies assess risk and streamline their lending processes. It was exactly the kind of work I had dreamed of doing, combining my engineering background with real-world applications that could make a difference in people's lives. But more than that, it was an opportunity to learn about an industry I was becoming increasingly fascinated with. Real estate, mortgages, property investment. These weren't just abstract concepts to me anymore. They were tools, weapons even, in the hands of someone who knew how to use them properly. And I was a very fast learner. My first day at the company was everything I had hoped it would be. My supervisor, Janet, was a brilliant woman in her 40s who had built her career in a male-dominated field through sheer competence and determination. She reminded me of the person I wanted to become: successful, independent, and completely in control of her own destiny. "Emma," she said as she showed me around the office, "I've read your academic record and your thesis on predictive algorithms. You have a gift for seeing patterns that others miss. That's exactly what we need here." It was the kind of recognition I had craved my entire life, and it was coming from someone who barely knew me but could see my potential immediately. The work was challenging and engaging. I was analyzing mortgage data, identifying trends in default rates, and developing models that could predict which borrowers were most likely to succeed or fail. It was like solving puzzles, and I was good at it. Very good at it. Within 6 months, I had streamlined 3 major processes and saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in risk assessment costs. Within a year, I was promoted to senior analyst. Within 18 months, I was leading my own team. And through it all, my phone remained silent. No calls from my parents asking how I was doing, no messages checking on my well-being, no attempts to bridge the gap they had created. At first, the silence hurt. I would find myself checking my phone, hoping for some sign that they missed me, that they regretted their decision. But as time passed and my success grew, the silence became liberating. I was building something incredible, and I was doing it without any help from them. Every achievement was mine alone. Every success was proof that their judgment of me had been completely wrong. It was during my second year in Seattle that I made the connection that would change everything. One of our clients was a mid-sized mortgage company that was struggling with their loan portfolio. They had a high default rate in a particular market segment, and they needed our help to figure out why. As I dug into their data, I noticed something interesting. The defaults were concentrated in a specific geographic area, the suburbs of my hometown, the very neighborhoods where I had grown up. More specifically, they were concentrated in the area where my parents still lived, in the house where I had spent my childhood being treated as a second-class citizen. It was a cruel irony that my professional expertise was now focused on the very place that had rejected me. But irony quickly turned to opportunity. The mortgage company was losing money hand over fist on these bad loans, and they were desperate for a solution. I had an idea, but it would require taking a significant risk. I could recommend that they restructure their entire approach to this market, essentially starting from scratch with new policies and procedures. Or I could suggest something more radical. I could suggest that they sell their troubled portfolio to someone who understood the market better, someone who could turn those bad loans around. Someone like me. The opportunity to buy that distressed mortgage portfolio wasn't just business. It was personal. But before I explain how I ended up owning the very loans that would give me power over my family's future, I need you to understand how we got here. Because this wasn't the first time my parents had chosen Tyler over me. It was just the most public, most brutal example of a pattern that had been destroying me for decades. I was 7 years old the first time I realized I wasn't the favorite. It was Christmas morning, and Tyler was 4. We had both been good that year, at least I thought we had. I had helped with dishes, kept my room clean, gotten straight A's in 2nd grade. Tyler had barely learned to tie his shoes and still threw tantrums when he didn't get his way. But when we ran downstairs to see what Santa had brought, the difference was impossible to ignore. Tyler's side of the tree was overflowing with packages: a new bike, a gaming system, action figures, remote control cars. My side had 3 small boxes: a book, a sweater, and a puzzle. I tried not to show my disappointment, but my mother noticed my face and sighed in that way that made me feel guilty for even feeling sad. "Emma, you're older," she said, as if that explained everything. "You understand that Santa has to be fair to all the children. Tyler is littler, so he needs more toys to keep him happy." Even at 7, I knew that explanation made no sense. If Santa was supposed to be fair, why wasn't this fair? But I nodded and smiled and played with my puzzle while Tyler screamed with joy over his mountain of gifts. That became the template for everything that followed. When Tyler wanted something, the family found a way to make it happen. When I wanted something, there was always a reason why it wasn't possible, why I needed to be more understanding, why I should be grateful for what I had. In 3rd grade, I begged my parents to let me take piano lessons. I had been fascinated by music since I could walk, and my teacher had told them I had natural ability. "We can't afford it right now," my father said. But 3 months later, when Tyler decided he wanted to play Little League, they somehow found the money for equipment, registration fees, and a private coach. When I pointed out the inconsistency, my mother gave me that look again. "Baseball is different, Emma. It's good for Tyler to learn teamwork and get exercise. Piano is just extra. Extra." That word would haunt me for years. I was always extra. Extra needs, extra wants, extra trouble. By 5th grade, I had learned to stop asking for things. It was easier to accept that Tyler's needs came first than to deal with the disappointment and the guilt-inducing explanations about why my desires were somehow less valid than his. I focused on school instead, throwing myself into academics, because that was something I could control, something I could excel at without needing their financial support or emotional investment. And I did excel. I made honor roll every semester. I won the school spelling bee. I placed first in the regional science fair with a project about renewable energy that I had researched and built entirely on my own. Each achievement felt like a small victory, a way to prove that I mattered, that I was worth their attention and pride. But somehow, my successes never seemed to register the way Tyler's mediocre accomplishments did. When he managed to pass 6th grade math after struggling, all year they took him out for a celebration dinner. When I won a statewide academic competition, they said, "That's nice, honey," and asked if I had seen Tyler's latest baseball trophy. The pattern became so consistent that I started to think there was something fundamentally wrong with me. Maybe I wasn't trying hard enough. Maybe I wasn't being grateful enough. Maybe if I just achieved more, accomplished more, made them prouder, they would finally see me the way they saw Tyler. High school was when the financial disparity became impossible to ignore. Tyler wanted to join the travel baseball team, which cost $3,000 plus equipment and travel expenses. Without hesitation, my parents found the money. They took out a small loan, sold my mother's jewelry, and asked my grandparents for help. Tyler got his dream team experience. That same year, I was accepted into a prestigious summer program for advanced mathematics and engineering. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that could set me up for success in college and beyond. The cost was $2,500, less than Tyler's baseball. But when I showed them the acceptance letter, my father barely looked up from his newspaper. "That's a lot of money for something that isn't even required for school," he said. "Can't you just take regular math? Classes like everyone else?" When I tried to explain how important this opportunity was, how it could help me get into a good engineering program, my mother interrupted. "Emma, you're already smart enough. You don't need special programs to prove that. Tyler needs baseball, because he's not as naturally gifted as you are. We have to help him find his strengths." The logic was twisted and painful. I was being punished for being naturally gifted by having opportunities taken away, while Tyler was being rewarded for his lack of natural ability with endless investment and support. I didn't go to the summer program. Instead, I spent those months working at the local grocery store, bagging groceries and cleaning floors to save money for college. At 16, I opened my own savings account with the money I earned, carefully, hiding it from my parents because I had learned not to trust them with anything that mattered to me. The summer job taught me something valuable, though I didn't realize it at the time. I learned that I could make my own money, control my own financial destiny, and that the feeling of earning something through my own effort was far more satisfying than receiving something as a gift. Every dollar I earned felt like a small declaration of independence. Meanwhile, Tyler was struggling. Despite all the investment in his baseball career, he wasn't good enough to make his high school varsity team. Despite all the tutoring and support, his grades were mediocre at best. But instead of acknowledging that their strategy wasn't working, my parents doubled down. They hired more tutors, enrolled him in more programs, and continued to pour money and attention into fixing his problems. I watched all of this with growing resentment and confusion. How could they not see that their approach was creating more problems than it solved? Tyler was becoming entitled and lazy, expecting everything to be handed to him without effort. And I was becoming invisible, my achievements minimized and my needs ignored. The breaking point came during my junior year of high school. I had been working toward early admission to several top engineering schools, maintaining a perfect GPA while working part-time and participating in robotics club. My guidance counselor told me I had a real shot at some significant scholarships, if I could just get the support I needed for applications and test prep. When I brought this up at dinner, my father looked annoyed. "College is expensive, Emma. We're not made of money. Maybe you should consider community college first, save us all some money." But later that same week, Tyler mentioned that he wanted to try private school for his senior year because he thought it might help his college prospects. Without a moment's hesitation, my parents started researching private schools and talking about how they could afford the tuition. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't about money. It had never been about money. This was about value, about who they considered worthy of investment. And in their eyes, Tyler would always be worth more than me. The realization was devastating, but also clarifying. I stopped expecting fairness because I finally understood that fairness was never part of the equation. Instead, I focused entirely on my own future, my own goals, my own path to success. If they weren't going to invest in me, I would invest in myself. I applied for early admission to 6 universities, paying the application fees with money from my grocery store job. I studied for the SATs using library books because I couldn't afford a prep course. I wrote my essays alone in my bedroom, pouring my heart into descriptions of my projects and achievements, trying to show admission committees the person my own family refused to see. When the acceptance letters started arriving, along with scholarship, offers that would cover most of my tuition, I felt a mix of triumph and sadness. I had done it entirely on my own, proved that I was worthy of the investment my parents had refused to make. But there was no one to share the victory with. My parents congratulated me with the same lukewarm enthusiasm they showed for everything I accomplished, while Tyler complained that I was making him look bad. The final insult came at my high school graduation. I was valedictorian, giving the commencement speech to a packed auditorium. I had worked 4 years for this moment, and I was proud of what I had achieved. As I stood at the podium looking out at the crowd, I could see my family sitting in the middle section. My parents looked bored, checking their phones and whispering to each other. Tyler was playing some game on his phone, not even pretending to pay attention. After the ceremony, as other families gathered around their graduates with flowers and cameras, my parents gave me a quick hug and said they were proud, but their attention was already elsewhere. Tyler had a baseball game the next day, and they needed to get home to help him prepare. My graduation party consisted of cake from the grocery store and 15 minutes of awkward conversation before they left to take Tyler to practice. That night, I sat in my room surrounded by graduation cards from teachers and friends, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I had achieved everything I had set out to achieve in high school. I was heading to college on a full scholarship. I had proven that I could succeed without their help. But none of it seemed to matter to the people whose approval I had spent 18 years trying to earn. College was supposed to be different. I was finally free from the daily reminders of my second-class status in my own family. I could focus on my studies, make friends who valued me for who I was, and build a life based on my own choices rather than their priorities. And in many ways, college was better. I loved my engineering classes, excelled in my coursework, and formed real friendships with people who appreciated my intelligence and ambition. I joined study groups and engineering competitions, took on leadership roles in student organizations, and began to see myself the way others saw me, as capable, valuable, and worthy of respect. But the family dynamics followed me even to college. During my freshman year, Tyler was still in high school, still struggling academically and socially. The calls home were always about him, his problems, his needs, his future. When I shared news about my academic achievements or internship opportunities, the conversations quickly shifted back to Tyler's latest crisis. "That's great, honey," my mother would say when I told her about making Dean's List or winning a competition. "But I'm really worried about your brother. He's having trouble with his math class again, and we think he might need to repeat it. Do you think you could tutor him when you come home for break? Even from hundreds of miles away, I was still expected to solve Tyler's problems and support his success, while my own achievements were treated as background noise. The expectation that I would drop everything to help him whenever he struggled was so deeply ingrained that my parents didn't even seem to realize they were asking me to sacrifice my own time and energy for his benefit. I started limiting my calls home, checking in once a week instead of every day. I stopped sharing details about my life and achievements, knowing they would be dismissed or overshadowed by Tyler's latest drama. I began to build a life that existed, entirely separate from my family, with friends and mentors who actually saw and valued who I was becoming. But the real revelation came during my sophomore year, when Tyler finally graduated high school and enrolled in college himself. Despite his mediocre grades and lack of direction, my parents managed to find a way to pay for his tuition at a decent state school. They took out loans, borrowed against their retirement, and asked relatives for money. Nothing was too much sacrifice to ensure Tyler got his college experience. When I called to congratulate Tyler on starting college, my mother mentioned casually that they were struggling with the financial burden. "It's worth it, though," she said. "Your brother deserves a chance to find himself and figure out what he wants to do with his life." The implication was clear. Tyler deserved chances and opportunities and financial support, while I had been expected to figure everything out on my own. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was thriving in college, excelling academically and professionally, building a future that would make them proud if they bothered to pay attention. Tyler was struggling through his first semester, calling home constantly for help with assignments and emotional support, clearly unprepared for the independence that college required. But their response to our different levels of success was predictable. They worried about Tyler and how to help him succeed. They assumed I would be fine no matter what, that my success was somehow inevitable, and required no support or encouragement from them. Even my achievements in college were seen as proof that I didn't need their help, rather than as accomplishments worthy of celebration. By my junior year, I had stopped expecting anything from them. I didn't call to share good news because I knew it wouldn't be received with enthusiasm. I didn't ask for help when I was struggling because I knew they were too focused on Tyler's problems to notice mine. I had become completely self-reliant, financially and emotionally independent in ways that should have made them proud, but instead seemed to justify their neglect. The pattern continued through my senior year and right up to graduation day. Every achievement was minimized. Every success was treated as expected rather than celebrated. When I was accepted to graduate school with full funding, they said, "That's nice." When Tyler passed his sophomore year by the skin of his teeth, they threw him a party. When I graduated summa cum laude with a job offer already in hand, they attended the ceremony but spent most of their time talking about Tyler's upcoming internship application. When I walked across that stage to receive my diploma, I could see them in the audience, but they were looking at their phones, missing the moment entirely. And then came that text message after graduation, the final confirmation of what I had known for years but had never wanted to accept. I wasn't their daughter in any meaningful sense. I was a stranger who happened to share their DNA, someone they could discard without consequence when I no longer served their purposes. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that all those years of neglect and dismissal had taught me something invaluable. I had learned to succeed without them. I had learned to find my own way, make my own money, and build my own life. I had learned that their approval wasn't necessary for my happiness or success. And most importantly, I had learned that the quiet, overlooked daughter they had always underestimated was capable of far more than they had ever imagined. While they were focused on Tyler's mediocre achievements and constant needs, I had been building something they couldn't see, something that would soon give me power they couldn't comprehend. The mortgage company opportunity that had fallen into my lap wasn't just a business deal. It was the culmination of everything they had taught me about self-reliance and independence, and it was about to teach them a lesson about underestimating the daughter they had thrown away. What my family never understood was that all those years of being overlooked had given me something more valuable than their approval: the ability to work in silence, to plan without fanfare, and to build something extraordinary while everyone was looking the other way. While they were celebrating Tyler's mediocre achievements and managing his constant crises, I was quietly creating a financial empire that would soon give me control over their entire future. It started with that distressed mortgage portfolio I had discovered through my work in Seattle. The mortgage company was hemorrhaging money on loans in my hometown area, and they were desperate to cut their losses. Most financial analysts would have recommended they simply write off the bad debt and move on. But I saw something different. I saw opportunity disguised as disaster. I had been studying the local real estate market for months, not just as a professional exercise, but as personal research. I knew those neighborhoods intimately. I had grown up there, walked those streets, understood the economic patterns that the distant mortgage company couldn't possibly grasp. The loans weren't failing because the properties were worthless, or the borrowers were irresponsible. They were failing because of a temporary economic downturn that was already showing signs of recovery. The key insight came to me during a late night at the office, while I was analyzing default patterns and cross-referencing them with local employment data. The major factory that had employed half the neighborhood had closed 2 years earlier, causing a wave of foreclosures and missed payments. But a new tech manufacturing plant was set to open just outside town in 6 months, bringing hundreds of high-paying jobs back to the area. The mortgage company saw the past and present problems. I saw the future recovery. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of recommending that my client write off their losses, I would recommend that they sell the entire portfolio to an investor who could manage it more effectively, and that investor would be me. But I couldn't just walk into my boss's office and announce that I wanted to buy $1 million mortgage portfolio. I was 24 years old with a good salary, but nowhere near that kind of capital. I needed a plan that was both ambitious and completely realistic. I needed to think several steps ahead, the way I had learned to do as a child when I was planning around my family's unpredictable priorities and limited resources. The first step was building credibility within the company. I had already established myself as one of their most insightful analysts, but I needed to be seen as someone with business acumen beyond just technical skills. I started volunteering for client presentations, offering to represent the company at industry conferences, and writing detailed reports that went beyond analysis to include strategic recommendations. My breakthrough came when I successfully predicted the recovery of a different struggling market in California. While other analysts were recommending that our client cut their losses, I argued that the fundamentals were strong and the downturn was temporary. 6 months later, that market rebounded exactly as I had predicted, saving the client millions of dollars and earning me recognition as someone who could see opportunities others missed. Janet, my supervisor, called me into her office after the California success. "Emma, you have a gift for seeing the bigger picture," she said. "Have you ever thought about starting your own consulting firm? You could make a lot more money working for yourself than you'll ever make working for us." The suggestion planted a seed that quickly grew into a comprehensive business plan. Why not start my own firm? I had the expertise, the track record, and increasingly, the industry connections. More importantly, I had something most consultants didn't have: intimate knowledge of markets that other analysts could only study from a distance. Over the next 6 months, I began laying the groundwork for my own company. I worked nights and weekends developing business plans, researching legal requirements, and building relationships with potential investors and clients. I kept my day job, maintaining my reputation and earning power while secretly building my exit strategy. The most crucial element was finding investors who could provide the capital I needed to make major moves in the real estate market. This proved to be easier than I had expected, largely because my track record spoke for itself. The California prediction had gotten attention throughout the industry, and several venture capital firms specializing in fintech were interested in backing analysts who wanted to strike out on their own. I met with 7 different investment groups over 3 months, presenting my business plan and my vision for a new kind of real estate analysis firm. Instead of just providing reports to clients, I wanted to put my own money behind my predictions, buying distressed assets that I believed were undervalued and managing them until they recovered. The 8th meeting was with Harrison Capital, a mid-sized firm that specialized in contrarian investments. They were intrigued by my approach and impressed by my track record, but they wanted to see me prove my concept on a smaller scale before committing major funding. "We like your thinking, Emma," said David Harrison, the firm's founding partner. "But we need to see you execute a successful deal before we can back you for the kind of money you're talking about. Can you identify a specific opportunity and walk us through how you would handle it?" That was when I told them about the mortgage portfolio in my hometown. I had already done extensive research on the properties, the borrowers, and the local economic conditions. I knew exactly how much the portfolio was worth, how much the current holder was likely to accept, and what it would take to turn those distressed loans into profitable investments. My presentation was thorough and compelling. I showed them employment, projections, property value trends, and demographic data that painted a clear picture of a market poised for recovery. Most importantly, I showed them that I could acquire the portfolio for approximately 60 cents on the dollar of its projected recovered value. Harrison Capital agreed to back my first major deal. They would provide the capital to purchase the mortgage portfolio, and I would manage the investment through my newly formed company, Sterling Property Solutions. If the deal succeeded as I projected, they would provide additional funding for larger acquisitions. The next step was approaching the mortgage company about selling their troubled portfolio. This required delicate negotiation, because I couldn't let them know that I was the analyst who had been studying their problems. I needed to appear as an independent investor who had identified an opportunity, not as an insider with confidential information. I hired a business attorney to handle the initial negotiations, presenting myself as a new investment firm specializing in distressed real estate assets. My offer was fair but aggressive. I would purchase the entire portfolio for 55% of the outstanding loan value, taking on all responsibility for collection and property management. The mortgage company was initially skeptical. They had been hoping to recover more of their losses, and my offer seemed low. But when their own analysts confirmed that the properties were likely to continue declining in value, and when I demonstrated that I had the capital to close quickly, they became more interested. The negotiation took 3 months, during which I continued working my day job while secretly planning the biggest financial move of my life. I spent evenings researching every property in the portfolio, understanding the specific circumstances of each borrower, and developing individual recovery strategies that would maximize the value of each asset. What I discovered during this research was both professionally exciting and personally significant. The portfolio included 47 properties scattered throughout my hometown and the surrounding suburbs. Most were single-family homes owned by working-class families who had fallen behind on payments due to job losses or medical expenses. A few were small commercial properties that had struggled during the economic downturn, and buried in the middle of the portfolio, listed under an LLC name I didn't initially recognize, was a property at 1247 Maple Street, my childhood home, the house where I had grown up feeling invisible and undervalued, the place where Tyler had been celebrated and I had been overlooked. The home my parents had mortgaged and remortgaged over the years to pay for Tyler's expenses and opportunities. When I realized what I was looking at, I had to step away from my computer and take a walk around the block. The irony was almost overwhelming. My parents had disowned me, cut me off, told me I was no longer their daughter because I had finally stood up for myself. And now, through a series of financial decisions they had made to support Tyler's mediocre college career. They had put their home directly into my hands. I researched the property records more thoroughly and discovered the full story. My parents had taken out a second mortgage 3 years earlier to pay for Tyler's college expenses. When he failed several classes and lost his partial scholarship, they had borrowed against the house again to keep him enrolled. The payments had become unmanageable, and they had fallen behind several times, only avoiding foreclosure through payment plans and extensions. But the mortgage company had finally run out of patience. The property was currently 2 months behind on payments, and foreclosure proceedings were scheduled to begin within 90 days. If I bought the portfolio, I wouldn't just own the debt on my childhood home. I would have the power to decide whether my parents kept their house or lost it entirely. The discovery added a personal dimension to what had been purely a business decision. But it also confirmed that I was making the right choice. This wasn't just about money or professional success. This was about justice, about the natural consequences of a lifetime of poor decisions and misplaced priorities. I completed the purchase of the mortgage portfolio in December, exactly 9 months after my parents had disowned me at graduation. The closing took place in a conference room in downtown Seattle, far from the family drama that had set everything in motion. Harrison Capital wired the funds, I signed the documents, and suddenly I owned 47 properties worth over $2 million, including the house where I had spent 18 years learning that I didn't matter. The former mortgage company was relieved to have the troubled assets off their books. Harrison Capital was confident they had backed a winner, and I was now the sole owner of a real estate portfolio that would either make me wealthy or teach me an expensive lesson about overconfidence. But success wasn't guaranteed. Owning the mortgages was just the first step. Now I had to prove that my analysis had been correct, that these distressed properties could be turned into profitable investments. I had to manage relationships with dozens of borrowers, some of whom were facing foreclosure, others who were working hard to catch up on payments. I had to balance compassion with business necessity, understanding that my investors expected returns while recognizing that these were real families facing real financial hardship. I quit my job in Seattle and moved back to my hometown, not because I missed it, but because successful property management required local presence. I rented a small office downtown and hired 2 assistants, a former bank loan officer who understood mortgage servicing and a real estate agent who knew the local market intimately. My strategy was both simple and sophisticated. For borrowers who were genuinely trying to recover from temporary setbacks, I would work out modified payment plans that made their mortgages affordable while still generating positive returns for my investors. For properties where the owners had abandoned them or could never realistically afford the payments, I would proceed with foreclosure and either renovate and sell the homes or convert them to rental properties. The approach required case-by-case analysis and constant attention to detail. I spent my days meeting with borrowers, inspecting properties, negotiating with contractors, and managing cash flow. It was exhausting work, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge I thrived on. Every problem had a solution. Every setback was an opportunity to learn. Every success validated my belief that I could build something meaningful entirely on my own terms. Within 6 months, my projections were proving accurate. The new manufacturing plant had opened on schedule, bringing hundreds of jobs back to the area. Property values were beginning to recover. Most importantly, the majority of my borrowers were finding ways to resume their payments, either through the original terms or through modified agreements that worked for everyone involved. Harrison Capital was impressed with my progress and eager to fund additional acquisitions. Other investment firms were beginning to take notice of my work, and I was getting calls from mortgage companies across the region who had their own distressed portfolios they wanted to sell. But through all of this professional success, I hadn't forgotten about the most personal property in my portfolio. I had been monitoring my parents' account carefully, tracking their payment history and financial status. They had managed to make One payment since I acquired their mortgage, but they were still behind overall, and their financial situation appeared to be deteriorating. I could have reached out to them, offered to work out a payment plan the way I was doing with other borrowers. I could have used my new position to help them, to show them that the daughter they had discarded was actually the one person who could save their home. But I didn't. Not yet. Because they still didn't know who owned their mortgage. They didn't know that their financial future was in the hands of the daughter they had rejected. They were still living in the same house where they had made me feel worthless, still prioritizing Tyler's needs over basic financial responsibility, still believing that they could continue making poor decisions without consequences. I wanted them to understand the full magnitude of their situation before I revealed my role in it. I wanted them to experience the same powerlessness and uncertainty that they had made me feel for so many years. I wanted them to learn what it felt like to have your future controlled by someone who had no reason to care about your welfare. So I waited. I managed their account through my property management company, sending official notices and payment demands without revealing my personal involvement. I watched as they struggled to make payments, as they borrowed money from relatives, as they considered selling the house they had mortgaged so heavily to support Tyler's failed college career. And all the while, I continued building my business, acquiring new properties, establishing myself as one of the most successful young real estate investors in the region. Local newspapers wrote articles about my company's innovative approach to distressed properties. Industry publications featured my strategies for turning around troubled mortgage portfolios. I was invited to speak at conferences and consulted by other investment firms. The quiet, overlooked daughter who had been dismissed and discarded was becoming a recognized expert in her field. The girl who had been told she wasn't worth investing in was now managing millions of dollars in real estate assets. The family member who had been cut off and disowned was now in a position to determine her family's financial fate, but they still didn't know. They had no idea that their financial crisis was being managed by the daughter they had rejected, that their home was owned by the woman they had told to figure out her own life. They didn't understand that every payment they made, every extension they requested, every desperate attempt to avoid foreclosure was being evaluated by someone who knew exactly how little they had valued her throughout her life. I was building toward a revelation that would change everything, but the timing had to be perfect. I needed them to fully understand their vulnerability before I showed them who held the power. I needed them to experience the same helplessness and dismissal that had defined my entire childhood. And most importantly, I needed Tyler to understand that his sister, the one whose achievements had been minimized and whose needs had been ignored, was now the only person who could save the home he had helped them lose through his endless financial demands and failures. The revelation was coming, but first they would learn what it felt like to be at someone else's mercy. They would discover what happened when you discarded someone who turned out to be more valuable than you ever imagined. The moment of truth arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in March, exactly 18 months after my parents had disowned me at graduation. I was sitting in my office reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant knocked on the door with a concerned expression. "Emma, there's a couple here to see you about their mortgage. They seem really upset and they're insisting they need to speak with the owner directly." I looked up from my paperwork, already knowing who was waiting in my reception area. I had been tracking their account carefully, watching as they fell further behind on payments despite repeated extensions and payment plans. The foreclosure notice had been sent 3 weeks ago, and today was their final day to either bring the account current or face legal proceedings. They had finally reached the point where they had no choice but to confront their mortgage holder directly. "Send them in," I said calmly, straightening my blazer and placing their file prominently on my desk. After 18 years of feeling powerless in their presence, I was about to reverse our positions completely. My mother entered first, looking older and more frazzled than I remembered. Her hair was streaked with gray, and she was carrying a worn purse clutched tightly against her chest. My father followed close behind, his shoulders hunched with defeat. They both looked around my office with confusion and growing anxiety, clearly uncomfortable in the professional environment but desperate enough to be there anyway. It took them a full 10 seconds to recognize me. My mother saw me first, her eyes widening in shock as she realized who was sitting behind the executive desk. My father's recognition came a moment later, followed by a look of disbelief that slowly transformed into something resembling panic. "Emma?" my mother whispered, as if she wasn't sure she could trust her own eyes. "What are you doing here?" I gestured to the chairs across from my desk with the same professional courtesy I showed all my clients. "Please have a seat. I understand you're here to discuss your mortgage account." My voice was steady and businesslike, giving no hint of the emotional complexity of the moment. They sat down slowly, still staring at me with confusion and growing dread. I could see them trying to process what they were seeing, trying to understand how their estranged daughter had ended up in a position of authority over their financial crisis. My father was the first to find his voice. "I don't understand. We came here to talk to someone about our house payment. The notice said we needed to contact Sterling Property Solutions. You work for them?" I opened their file and spread the documents across my desk where they could see them. Mortgage statements, payment history, legal notices, and property assessments. Their entire financial life laid out in black and white. "I don't work for Sterling Property Solutions," I said calmly. "I own it. And I own your mortgage." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as the full implications of the situation dawned on them. The daughter they had discarded now held the power to decide whether they kept their home or lost everything. The child they had deemed worthless was now their only hope for financial survival. My mother began to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the foreclosure notice on my desk. My father just looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. "How?" he finally asked. "How is this possible?" I leaned back in my chair, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the emotional weight of the moment. "It's quite simple, actually. Your mortgage was part of a distressed portfolio that came on the market last year. I acquired it as an investment, along with several other properties in the area. I had no idea your house was included until after the purchase was complete." It was technically true, though it omitted the fact that I had known exactly what I was buying and had specifically wanted their mortgage as part of the deal. But they didn't need to know that level of detail. "Emma, please," my mother said, reaching across the desk as if to touch my hand. I pulled back slightly, maintaining the professional distance. "We're family. Surely we can work something out." The word family hung in the air between us like a challenge. I looked at her steadily, letting the irony sink in before responding. "According to the text message I received 18 months ago, we're not family anymore. You made that very clear." My father's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. That was. We were upset about Tyler's situation. We said things we didn't mean. "Tyler's situation," I repeated, pulling out another file from my desk drawer. "Yes, let's talk about Tyler's situation. According to your mortgage records, you've borrowed over $80,000 against this house to pay for his college expenses over the past 4 years. You've refinanced twice, taken out a second mortgage, and missed numerous payments because you were prioritizing his education over your basic financial obligations." I laid out the payment history, showing them exactly how their financial crisis had developed. Every missed payment corresponded to a major expense for Tyler. Every extension request came when he needed money for something else. The pattern was unmistakable and damning. "He's our son," my mother said weakly. "We had to help him." "And what am I?" I asked quietly. "Because when I needed help, when I asked for support for academic programs and college preparation, you told me we couldn't afford it. When I succeeded despite that lack of support, you told me it proved I didn't need help." And when I finally stood up for myself, you disowned me. My father tried to regain some authority in the conversation. Emma, this is business, right? You're a businesswoman now. What do we need to do to resolve this situation? I pulled out a calculator and began running numbers, speaking in the same professional tone I used with all my clients. You're currently 4 months behind on payments, which brings your total outstanding balance to $187,000. You've received multiple extensions and payment plans, all of which you've failed to maintain. At this point, to avoid foreclosure, you would need to bring the account completely current, which means paying $12,400 immediately, plus all associated legal fees and penalties. The number hit them like a physical blow. My mother actually gasped, and my father's shoulders sagged further. We don't have that kind of money, he admitted. That's why we're here. We were hoping to work out another payment plan. I nodded, as if I was considering their request, though I had already decided exactly how this conversation would end. I understand your situation is difficult. However, this account has already received more extensions and modifications than I typically allow. You've demonstrated a pattern of making promises you can't keep. But this is our home, my mother pleaded. We've lived here for 25 years. Tyler grew up here. All our memories are here. Tyler grew up here, I agreed. And yet Tyler isn't here now to help with the payments, is he? Where is Tyler while you're facing foreclosure because of the debt you accumulated supporting him? The question hung in the air unanswered because we all knew the truth. Tyler was living his life, working an entry-level job in another city, completely disconnected from the financial crisis his demands had created. He had moved on from the family home that was being sacrificed for his benefit, leaving my parents to face the consequences alone. Have you asked Tyler to help with the payments? I continued. Has he offered to contribute to saving the home that was mortgaged to pay for his education? My father looked uncomfortable. Tyler's just starting his career. He doesn't make much money yet. I see. So Tyler gets the benefit of the investment you made in his future, but none of the responsibility for the cost. That seems consistent with the family pattern I remember. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I had grown up feeling invisible and unvalued. When I turned back to face them, I had made my decision about how this would end. I'm going to make you an offer, I said, returning to my desk. It's the same offer I would make to any client in your situation, so please don't assume you're getting special treatment. I pulled out a fresh contract and began filling in the details. I will allow you to keep the house under the following conditions. First, you will sign a new promissory note for the full amount owed, including all penalties and fees. Second, you will make monthly payments of $1,800, which is higher than your previous payment, but reflects the current balance and risk level. Third, if you miss a single payment going forward, foreclosure proceedings will begin immediately with no further extensions or negotiations. They stared at the contract as if it was written in a foreign language. The payment amount was significantly higher than they had been paying before, and I could see them trying to figure out how they could possibly manage it. There's one more condition, I continued. Tyler will need to co-sign the new note and become personally responsible for the debt. If he benefited from the money that created this situation, he should share responsibility for resolving it. My father shook his head immediately. We can't ask Tyler to do that. It would ruin his credit if we defaulted. He's trying to build his life. And what about your credit? I asked. What about the life you've built? Why is protecting Tyler's future more important than protecting your own home? The question revealed the same twisted logic that had governed their decisions throughout my childhood. Tyler's welfare was always the priority, even when it came at the cost of everyone else's security and well-being. Even facing foreclosure, they were more concerned about protecting him from consequences than they were about saving themselves. We need time to think about this, my mother said. Can we discuss it and get back to you? I looked at my watch with deliberate emphasis. Your foreclosure notice specified that all arrangements had to be finalized by 5 p.m. today. It's currently 3:30. You have 90 minutes to decide whether you want to accept my offer or proceed with foreclosure. The deadline was real, but I could have extended it if I chose to. I wanted them to feel the pressure of time running out, the same way I had felt pressured and rushed throughout my childhood whenever I needed something from them. Emma, please, my mother tried again. Can't we work something out as a family? I sat back down and looked at her directly. You keep using that word, family, but families support each other. Families invest in each other's success. Families celebrate each other's achievements. When did you ever treat me like family? The question silenced her because we all knew the answer. They had treated Tyler like precious family while treating me like a convenient resource. They had invested in his future while expecting me to fund my own. They had celebrated his mediocre accomplishments while dismissing my exceptional ones. I know we made mistakes, my father said quietly. We should have been better parents to you. We should have recognized what you were achieving and supported you more. Should have, I repeated. Yes, you should have, but you didn't. And when I finally asked you to treat me with basic respect, you disowned me. You told me to figure out my own life. Well, I did. And now you need to figure out yours. I pulled out my phone and checked the time again. You have 85 minutes to make your decision. I have other appointments this afternoon, so I'll need your answer before I leave the office. They looked at each other with the desperation of people who had run out of options. I could see them trying to find some angle, some argument that would change the terms in their favor. But there wasn't one. For the first time in their lives, they were completely dependent on my goodwill, and I was under no obligation to provide it. What would it take for you to give us better terms? My father asked finally. What do you want from us? It was the question I had been waiting for, the moment when they would finally acknowledge that they needed something from me that I wasn't obligated to give. I let the silence stretch out, considering how to respond. I want you to understand. Something, I said finally. This situation exists because of choices you made. You chose to mortgage your home to pay for Tyler's college. You chose to miss payments when he needed money for other things. You chose to prioritize his immediate wants over your long-term financial security. And you chose to disown the daughter who could have helped you make better decisions. I stood up again and walked around the desk, sitting on the edge so I was closer to them, but still in a position of authority. Every financial crisis has consequences. You're experiencing those consequences now. I'm not the cause of your problems. I'm just the person who ended up in a position to decide how they get resolved. My mother was crying harder now, and my father looked like he had aged 10 years in the past hour. They were finally understanding that their actions had led them to this moment, that the daughter they had discarded was now the only person who could save them. We'll take your offer, my father said quietly. The payment plan, the co-signer requirement, all of it. We'll make it work somehow. I nodded and pulled the contract toward them. You'll need Tyler to come in and sign the documents in person. I don't accept electronic signatures for co-signers. Can he be here by tomorrow afternoon? They looked at each other uncertainly. I knew they were dreading the conversation with Tyler, dreading having to explain how their financial support for him had put the family home at risk and now required his personal guarantee to save it. We'll call him tonight, my mother said. He'll understand. He's family. There was that word again. Tyler was family, so he would understand and help. I had been family too, but that hadn't protected me from being discarded when I inconvenienced them. The double standard was still operating, even in their moment of crisis. One more thing, I said as they prepared to leave. This conversation and this arrangement are confidential. I run a business that depends on professional discretion. I don't want details of our family relationship discussed with other clients or in the community. This is a business transaction, nothing more. They nodded eagerly, probably relieved that I wasn't planning to publicize their situation. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't protecting them from embarrassment. I was protecting my own professional reputation and maintaining the boundaries that had taken me years to establish. After they left, I sat alone in my office reviewing the signed preliminary agreement. In less than 24 hours, Tyler would be sitting in the same chairs, learning that his sister now controlled his parents' financial future and that his own credit and assets were now at risk because of the debt accumulated in his name. But more importantly, my parents would finally understand the true cost of their choices. They would see that the daughter they had deemed expendable was actually the most valuable member of their family. They would learn that dismissing someone's worth doesn't make them worthless. It just makes you blind to their value until it's too late to benefit from it. The next afternoon, Tyler arrived at my office with my parents, looking confused and resentful about being dragged into what he clearly saw as their problem. He walked in with the same entitled posture I remembered from childhood, the assumption that whatever crisis had arisen would be resolved without significant inconvenience to him. His recognition was faster than our parents had been, probably, because he had been thinking about me since they called him the previous evening. But his reaction was different too. Where they had shown shock and desperation, he showed anger and accusation. "What kind of game are you playing, Emma?" he demanded before even sitting down. "Mom and Dad said you own their mortgage now. How is that possible?" I gestured to the chair across from my desk with the same professional courtesy I had shown our parents. "Please sit down, Tyler. We have documents to review and sign." He remained standing, trying to maintain some sense of dominance in the situation. "I'm not signing anything until you explain how you ended up owning our family home." "It's quite simple," I replied, pulling out his file. "Your parents mortgaged the house repeatedly to pay for your college expenses. When they couldn't maintain the payments, their mortgage company sold the loan to investors. I was one of those investors. Now I hold the note, and they're in default." The explanation was factual and professional, giving him no emotional leverage to work with. He looked to our parents for support, but they were focused on the documents on my desk, clearly hoping he would just sign and save their home. "This is insane," he said, finally sitting down but maintaining his aggressive posture. "You can't seriously expect me to co-sign their debt. I didn't know they were borrowing money against the house." I opened his file and pulled out financial records I had compiled. "According to these bank records, you received over $80,000 from your parents over 4 years. Tuition payments, living expenses, car payments, credit card payments, and various other transfers. You may not have known the money was coming from home equity loans, but you certainly knew you were receiving it." The documentation was thorough and undeniable. Every payment from our parents to Tyler, every expense they had covered, every debt they had assumed on his behalf. The pattern showed clearly that their financial crisis was directly related to their investment in his future. "They offered to pay for college," he said defensively. "I didn't force them to do anything." "No, but you accepted their support without question, didn't you? You never asked if they could afford it. You never offered to take out student loans or work part-time to reduce the burden. You just assumed they would handle the cost, regardless of the impact on their own financial security." Tyler's anger was building, but I could see uncertainty creeping in as well. He was beginning to understand that this situation was more serious than he had initially realized, and that his own financial future was now at stake. "What exactly are you asking me to sign?" he asked, reaching for the contract. I walked him through the terms carefully, explaining that he would become jointly responsible for the full mortgage balance, that his credit would be impacted if payments were missed, and that his assets could be pursued if the account went into default. "This is ridiculous," he said, pushing the contract away. "I'm not taking responsibility for their poor financial decisions." The irony was breathtaking. Tyler, who had benefited from every poor financial decision our parents had made, was now refusing to accept responsibility for the consequences. He wanted the benefits of their sacrifice without any of the costs. "That's your choice," I said, calmly. "But without a co-signer, I can't approve the payment plan. Foreclosure proceedings will continue as scheduled." My parents looked stricken. They had been counting on Tyler to save them, just as they had always counted on him to be the solution to their problems. But Tyler, true to form, was prioritizing his own interests over their desperate need. "There has to be another way," my mother pleaded. "Tyler, please, this is our home. Where will we live if we lose it?" Tyler looked genuinely conflicted for the first time since entering my office. He cared about our parents, in his own limited way, but he cared about his own financial security more. The same selfishness that had characterized his entire relationship with our family was now preventing him from saving them. "I need time to think about this," he said finally. "This is a huge decision." I checked my watch again. "The payment plan offer expires at 5 p.m. today. If you're not prepared to sign now, I'll need to proceed with foreclosure." "You're really going to foreclose on our parents' house?" Tyler asked, as if he couldn't believe I was capable of such action. "I'm going to foreclose on a property where the borrowers have consistently failed to meet their obligations, and where no acceptable payment arrangement can be reached. The fact that the borrowers happen to be related to me doesn't change the business reality." Tyler stared at me with a mixture of anger and something that might have been respect. For the first time in his life, he was seeing me as someone with real power, someone who couldn't be dismissed or overlooked. "Fine," he said, reaching for the pen. "I'll sign your contract. But this doesn't make us even. You're destroying our family over money." I watched him sign the documents, making him legally responsible for the debt his demands had created. "I'm not destroying anything, Tyler. I'm just refusing to fix something I didn't break." After they left, I filed the new mortgage agreement and updated their account status. They had 90 days to make their first payment under the new terms, and I would be watching carefully to see if they could maintain their obligations. But more importantly, the dynamic had shifted permanently. I was no longer the dismissed daughter asking for scraps of attention and support. I was the decision-maker, the person with power, the one whose approval they needed to maintain their way of life. They would never again be able to take me for granted, because they would never again be certain that I needed them more than they needed me. The tables had turned completely, and there was no going back. 6 months after Tyler signed that co-signer agreement, I was standing in the boardroom of Harrison Capital, presenting my annual report to a room full of investors who had backed my vision when I was just an ambitious analyst with a theory. The numbers on the projection screen told a story of remarkable success. My real estate portfolio had grown to over $8 million in assets, with a return rate that exceeded industry standards by 40%. Sterling Property Solutions has exceeded every projection we made when we first funded Emma's venture, David Harrison announced to the assembled investors. She's proven that distressed real estate can be transformed into profitable investments when managed by someone who understands both the financial and human elements of property ownership. The applause that followed felt different from any recognition I had received before. This wasn't polite acknowledgement or grudging respect. This was genuine appreciation from people who measured success in concrete terms and found my results impressive by any standard. I had built something real, something valuable, something that existed entirely because of my own vision and effort. After the presentation, several investors approached me with offers to fund expansion into new markets. A major bank wanted to discuss a partnership for handling their distressed portfolios. 2 different business schools asked if I would consider teaching a seminar on contrarian real estate investment. I was no longer just successful. I was becoming influential in my industry. But the most satisfying conversation happened as I was leaving the building. Janet, my former supervisor from Seattle, was waiting by the elevator. She had flown in specifically to attend my presentation, and her smile was proud in a way that reminded me what genuine support looked like. "Emma, I knew you had potential when you worked for me, but this exceeds even my highest expectations," she said. "You've built something extraordinary. More importantly, you've built it with integrity. Your borrowers speak about you with respect, even the ones who've had to face difficult conversations. That says something about who you are as a person, not just as a businesswoman." The comment meant more to me than she could possibly know. Throughout the process of building my company, I had been conscious of the difference between justice and cruelty, between holding people accountable and simply punishing them. My parents and Tyler had faced consequences for their choices, but those consequences were directly related to their actions and applied according to the same standards I used for all my clients. That evening, I drove through my hometown, past the neighborhoods where I now owned dozens of properties, past the school where I had won academic competitions that went unnoticed, past the house where I had learned that love was conditional and approval had to be earned through silence and compliance. The place looked smaller than I remembered, less significant, as if my success had somehow diminished its power over my memories. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. "Emma, your parents called the office. They wanted to know if you would consider having dinner with them sometime. They said they have something important to discuss." I stared at the message for a long moment, then put the phone away without responding. They were 3 months current on their mortgage payments, having managed to meet their obligations since Tyler's co-signature had given them access to his credit for additional borrowing. But their financial situation remained precarious, dependent on both Tyler's cooperation and their ability to maintain employment in an uncertain economy. I had been expecting this overture for months. As my success became more visible in the community, as local newspapers wrote articles about my business achievements, they would naturally want to reconnect with the daughter they had discarded. But their motivation wasn't pride in my accomplishments, or regret for their treatment of me. It was the recognition that I had become someone who could be useful to them again. 3 days later, I received a more direct approach. Tyler called my office, asking to speak with me personally. My assistant put him through, and I accepted the call with curiosity about what angle he would take. "Emma, I think we should talk," he said without preamble. "Not about business, just as brother and sister. I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I want to understand your perspective." The words were carefully chosen, designed to sound conciliatory without admitting any wrongdoing. Tyler had always been skilled at managing conversations to his advantage, and I could hear the same manipulative undertones that had characterized his interactions throughout our childhood. "What would you like to understand?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "I get that you're angry about how things went down after graduation," he said. "Mom and Dad handled that badly, and I should have said something at the time. But we're family, Emma. We should be able to work through this." There it was again. Family. The word they deployed whenever they needed something from me, but never when I needed something from them. The concept they had weaponized to justify years of unequal treatment and then abandoned entirely when I finally demanded basic respect. "Tyler, you keep using that word as if it means something to you," I replied. "But family members don't allow their parents to mortgage their home to pay for college expenses they could have covered through loans or work. Family members don't stand by silently while their sister gets disowned for refusing to fund their lifestyle. And family members don't wait until their sister becomes successful to suddenly discover they want a relationship." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its calculated charm and taken on a tone I rarely heard from him, genuine uncertainty. "I didn't know they were mortgaging the house," he said quietly. "I thought they could afford to help me. I never asked them to go into debt." "But you never asked if they could afford it either," I pointed out. "You just assumed that your needs were more important than their financial security. Just like you assumed my achievements didn't matter as much as your struggles. Just like you assumed I would always be available to clean up whatever messes your choices created. Another long pause. So what now? You hold our mortgage forever? You keep us under your control as some kind of revenge? The question revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He still saw this as being about control and revenge, rather than about natural consequences and personal responsibility. He couldn't conceive of a world where I wasn't motivated by the same petty dynamics that had governed our family relationships for decades. Tyler, I don't want to control you or anyone else. I want to run my business successfully and build a life that has nothing to do with the dysfunction I grew up with. You and our parents are my clients now, nothing more. You'll make your payments, or face the consequences, the same as anyone else. But we could be more than that, he pressed. We could be a real family again. I know Mom and Dad regret how they handled things. They talk about you all the time, about how proud they are of what you've accomplished. The manipulation was clumsy, but predictable. Now that I was successful, they were proud. Now that I had power, they wanted a relationship. Now that I could be useful to them again, family bonds suddenly mattered. It's interesting that their pride coincides so perfectly with my usefulness, I observed. When I was achieving academic success that could benefit our family's reputation, they were indifferent. When I was building a business that could solve their financial problems, they were absent. But now that I'm established and influential, they're proud. The timing is quite remarkable. Tyler's frustration finally broke through his diplomatic facade. God, Emma, do you have to analyze everything like a business transaction? Can't you just forgive and move on? People make mistakes. People do make mistakes, I agreed. But patterns aren't mistakes. Systematic favoritism isn't a mistake. Disowning your daughter for standing up for herself isn't a mistake. Those are choices, Tyler. And choices have consequences. I could hear him taking a deep breath, probably trying to regain his composure. When he spoke again, his voice had taken on the pleading tone I remembered from childhood, the one he used when his charm failed to get him what he wanted. What would it take, Emma? What would we have to do for you to consider letting us back into your life? The question hung in the air while I considered how to respond. What would it take? An acknowledgement of the damage they had done? An apology for the years of dismissal and neglect? A recognition that I had been right to demand better treatment, and that they had been wrong to discard me for it? Tyler, you're asking the wrong question, I said finally. This isn't about what you can do to earn your way back into my life. This is about what I've learned about myself and what I want my life to look like going forward. What do you mean? I mean that I've discovered I don't need your approval or validation to be successful and happy. I've built meaningful relationships with people who value me from the beginning, not just after I prove my worth to them. I've created a career that fulfills me and challenges me in ways I never experienced while trying to earn recognition from people who were determined not to give it. I paused, looking out my office window at the bustling downtown street where my business had become a respected part of the community. I've learned that the family I was born into isn't necessarily the family I deserve. And I've decided that I'm not interested in settling for less than I deserve anymore. Tyler was quiet for so long that I began to think the call had ended. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, more vulnerable than I had ever heard it. So that's it? You're just done with us forever? I'm done with the version of us. That existed before, I clarified. The version where my needs didn't matter, my achievements went unrecognized, and my role was to facilitate everyone else's success while expecting nothing in return. If you want to build something different, something healthier, that would require acknowledging what went wrong and taking responsibility for changing it. And if we did that, if we acknowledged our mistakes and tried to do better? I considered the question carefully. Could they change? Could people who had spent decades operating according to twisted priorities and selfish logic suddenly develop the capacity for genuine reflection and growth? Tyler, you're talking about fundamental changes in how you see yourselves and how you treat other people. That kind of transformation requires more than just saying the right words. It requires sustained effort and genuine commitment to being different than you've been. But it's possible? Anything is possible, I said. But it's not probable. And more importantly, it's not my responsibility to manage your personal growth or to sacrifice my peace of mind while you figure out whether you're capable of being better people. The conversation ended shortly after that, with Tyler promising to think about what I had said and me feeling surprisingly peaceful about the interaction. I had stated my position clearly and honestly, without cruelty, but also without false hope. Whatever happened next would be their choice, and I was genuinely comfortable with any outcome. 2 weeks later, my assistant handed me an envelope that had been delivered by hand rather than through the mail. Inside was a letter written on stationery I recognized from my childhood, the good paper my mother used for important correspondence. "Dear Emma," it began, "your father and I have been talking since Tyler's conversation with you, and we realize we owe you more than just an apology. We owe you an acknowledgement of the hurt we caused and the opportunities we cost you through our favoritism and our inability to see your worth." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing specific incidents from my childhood and acknowledging the impact of their choices. They admitted to the financial favoritism, to the emotional neglect, to the way they had taken my compliance for granted while celebrating Tyler's minimal efforts. Most importantly, they took responsibility for the pattern of behavior rather than dismissing it as individual mistakes. "We understand if you don't want a relationship with us," the letter concluded. "We understand that we forfeited the right to be part of your success when we failed to support you in building it. But we want you to know that we see now what we should have seen then, that you are remarkable, that you deserved better from us, and that our failure to recognize your value was our loss, not your shortcoming." I read the letter twice, looking for the manipulation or self-serving elements that had characterized most of my family's communication. But the tone felt different this time. Instead of asking for something, they were simply acknowledging what had happened and accepting responsibility for their role in it. The letter was signed by both parents, but there was a postscript in my mother's handwriting. "We kept the newspaper articles about your business success. We have them in a scrapbook, even though we know we don't deserve to claim pride in accomplishments. We did nothing to support. We keep them because we want to remember who you became despite us, not because of us." I set the letter aside and returned to my work, but it stayed in my thoughts throughout the day. Was this genuine growth or sophisticated manipulation? Did their motivation matter if the behavior change was real? And what did I want my response to be? That evening, I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother was buried. She had been the one person in the family who had always seen and valued me, who had encouraged my academic pursuits and told me I was capable of extraordinary things. I sat by her grave and read the letter aloud, as if seeking her counsel on how to respond. "What do you think, Grandma?" I asked the gathering darkness. "Are they capable of changing? Or is this just another way of trying to get what they want from me?" The answer came not in words, but in a memory. I was 10 years old, sitting in my grandmother's kitchen while she made cookies for my school bake sale. My parents had forgotten about the assignment until that morning, and I was upset about not having anything to contribute. "Emma," my grandmother had said, "sometimes people show you who they are through their priorities. When someone cares about you, supporting you feels natural to them. When they don't, they'll always have reasons why they can't help." She had paused in her mixing to look at me directly. "The question isn't whether they have reasons. The question is whether they choose to find solutions despite the reasons." Sitting by her grave 20 years later, I understood what she had been trying to teach me. My parents' letter was full of acknowledgments and apologies, but what mattered was whether they would choose to find solutions when supporting me required sacrifice or inconvenience. The real test wouldn't come in a carefully crafted letter. It would come in daily choices, in ongoing behavior, in their willingness to prioritize my well-being even when it conflicted with their comfort. 3 months later, that test arrived in an unexpected form. I received a call from a reporter at the local business journal who was writing a feature article about successful young entrepreneurs in the region. She wanted to interview me about my company and my approach to real estate investment. "I'd also like to include some background about your family and upbringing," she mentioned during our preliminary conversation. "I understand your parents still live in the area. It would be great to get their perspective on your success and how they supported your entrepreneurial development." I paused, considering my response. This was exactly the kind of situation where my family's pattern would typically reassert itself. They would want to be featured in the article, to claim credit for my success, to present themselves as supportive parents who had always believed in my potential. The old Emma would have allowed this fiction to preserve family harmony. But I wasn't the old Emma anymore. "I'd prefer to keep the focus on my business rather than my family background," I told the reporter. "My success is independent of my upbringing, and I think that's a more interesting and accurate story." The reporter was disappointed, but accepted my preference. The article, when it was published, focused entirely on my business strategies and professional achievements. There was no mention of my family, no quotes from proud parents, no narrative about early support and encouragement. 2 days after publication, my mother called my office. For the first time in over 2 years, I accepted the call directly rather than having my assistant screen it. "Emma, we saw the article in the business journal," she said. "It was wonderful. You should be very proud of everything you've accomplished." I waited for the inevitable follow-up, the complaint about being excluded, the request to be included in future publicity. But it didn't come. "We wanted you to know that we understand why you didn't include us," she continued. "We haven't earned the right to share in your success publicly. But we're proud of you anyway, even if we can't say so in the newspaper." The response surprised me. Instead of making the article about their hurt feelings or their desire for recognition, they had focused on my achievement and accepted their exclusion as appropriate. It was a small thing, but it suggested a different mindset than the one that had governed their behavior throughout my childhood. "Thank you," I said simply. "I appreciate you saying that. Emma, would you be willing to meet for coffee sometime? Not to ask for anything, just to talk. I know we don't deserve your time, but I'd like the chance to know who you've become." The request was humble in a way that felt unfamiliar coming from my mother. No demands, no assumptions about my obligations, no guilt about what I owed them as their daughter. Just a simple request that acknowledged my right to refuse. "Let me think about it," I replied. "I'll call you next week." That conversation led to a series of careful, limited meetings over the following months. Coffee in neutral locations, conversations focused on my current life rather than our shared past, interactions that resembled acquaintance building more than family reunion. My parents were respectful of my boundaries, grateful for whatever time I was willing to give, and careful not to overstep or assume intimacy they hadn't earned. Tyler's approach was different, but equally cautious. He sent occasional text messages sharing updates about his life without asking for responses, acknowledging my achievements when they appeared in local media without claiming any connection to them, and offering help with business referrals without expecting anything in return. Slowly, carefully, we began building something that resembled a functional adult relationship. Not the close family bond they had forfeited through years of poor choices, but a respectful connection between people who shared history and were willing to create something better going forward. The transformation wasn't complete or perfect, There were still moments when old patterns surfaced, when they reverted to familiar dynamics or expectations, but increasingly they caught themselves and corrected course. They were learning to treat me as an autonomous adult whose goodwill had to be earned rather than assumed. A year after our first coffee meeting, my mother sent me a photo from Tyler's graduation from a professional certification program he had completed while working full-time. "Tyler wanted you to know about his achievement," the message read. "He paid for the program himself and is proud of completing it independently." The message was significant, not just because Tyler had accomplished something through his own effort, but because they had shared it without asking for anything in return. They were learning to celebrate my siblings' achievements without expecting me to contribute to them, just as they were learning to acknowledge my success without claiming credit for it. 2 years after our relationship began its slow reconstruction, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called a family meeting, inviting my parents and Tyler to my office for a conversation about our future. "I want you to know that I've been watching how you've handled yourselves over the past 2 years," I began. "You've respected my boundaries, acknowledged your mistakes, and shown me through your actions that you're capable of change." They sat quietly, listening without interrupting or trying to guide the conversation toward their preferred outcome. "I'm not interested in recreating the family dynamic we had before," I continued. "That version of our relationship was unhealthy and damaging, and I won't go back to it. But I am interested in building something new, something based on mutual respect and appropriate boundaries." My father leaned forward slightly. "What would that look like?" "It would look like treating each other as adults who choose to be in each other's lives, rather than as family members with automatic claims on each other's time and resources. It would mean celebrating each other's achievements without taking credit for them. It would mean supporting each other through difficulties without creating dependencies. And it would mean maintaining honest communication even when it's uncomfortable." My mother nodded slowly. "We'd like to try that. We'd like to earn the right to be part of your life again." "Then let's start small," I said. "Monthly dinners, family holidays if we all want to participate, sharing news and achievements without expectations of special treatment. We'll see how it goes and adjust as needed." Tyler had been quiet throughout the conversation, but now he spoke up. "Emma, I want you to know that I understand what I cost you, both growing up and in how things ended after graduation. I can't undo any of that, but I want to do better going forward." The acknowledgement meant more to me than elaborate apologies or dramatic gestures would have. It was simple, direct, and focused on future behavior rather than past justifications. That conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter in our family relationships. We started having monthly dinners at neutral restaurants, sharing holidays that felt comfortable rather than obligatory, and gradually building trust through consistent, respectful behavior. The process wasn't always smooth. There were setbacks and misunderstandings, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface. But increasingly, we all caught ourselves and returned to the healthier dynamic we were working to establish. Most importantly, I never lost sight of the fact that this reconciliation was a choice, not an obligation. I maintained my independence, my boundaries, and my commitment to my own well-being. The family relationships became an addition to my life rather than the center of it, which allowed them to be healthier and more sustainable. 5 years after my parents had disowned me at graduation, I stood in the same university auditorium, where that painful scene had unfolded. But this time, I was the one being honored. The engineering school was presenting me with their Distinguished Alumni Award for Entrepreneurial Achievement and Community Impact. As I walked across the stage, to accept the award, I could see my family in the audience. They were applauding with genuine pride, not the possessive pride of people claiming credit, but the respectful admiration of people who understood they were witnessing something they had no role in creating. After the ceremony, they waited for me to finish speaking with well-wishers and media representatives. When I finally made my way over to them, my mother hugged me carefully, as if still uncertain about physical affection. "We're so proud of you, Emma," she said. "Not because you're our daughter, but because of who you chose to become." The distinction was important and showed how much they had learned about appropriate relationships. They were proud of me as a person, not possessive of me as a family member. That evening, we went to dinner together to celebrate, not because it was expected or obligated, but because we all chose to share the moment. The conversation was easy and genuine, focused on my achievement and my future plans, rather than on family dynamics or past grievances. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to that moment. I had built a successful business, established financial independence, created meaningful relationships, and earned recognition for my professional achievements. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned that my worth didn't depend on other people's recognition of it. The family that had once made me feel invisible and expendable now treated me with respect and admiration. But their validation was no longer necessary for my sense of self-worth. I had learned to value myself independently of their opinion, which paradoxically made their renewed respect more meaningful rather than less. I thought about the scared, overlooked girl who had walked away from her graduation feeling rejected and alone. She couldn't have imagined that the pain of that rejection would become the catalyst for building something extraordinary. She couldn't have predicted that being discarded by her family would teach her to value herself enough to demand better treatment from everyone in her life. The mortgage on my childhood home had been paid off 6 months earlier. My parents had managed to refinance through a traditional lender, removing me from any ongoing financial relationship with their housing situation. Tyler had successfully co-signed the refinancing, taking responsibility for supporting the home that had been mortgaged to support his education. I kept the original mortgage documents in my office safe, not as a threat or a reminder of power, but as a symbol of how completely circumstances could change when people chose to grow and change themselves. The same house that had once represented my powerlessness now represented my family's commitment to taking responsibility for their own choices. My business continued to grow and evolve. I had expanded into commercial real estate, opened offices in 3 cities, and developed a reputation as someone who could see value where others saw only problems. But the success felt sustainable now, built on solid foundations rather than driven by the need to prove my worth to people who had refused to see it. I had learned that the best revenge wasn't cruelty or punishment. It was building a life so fulfilling and successful that the approval of people who had failed to appreciate you became irrelevant. It was becoming so secure in your own worth that other people's recognition became a nice addition rather than a desperate necessity. The girl who had been told to figure out her own life had done exactly that. And in doing so, she had figured out something even more valuable: that she had always been worth more than the people who failed to recognize her value had made her believe. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.